Hello viewers, and welcome back to the 5 tips for better AXSRS reporting. We are now on tip 3, which is specify group structure at runtime. Now, this might not make sense to you if you're not familiar with subgroups and drill-through reports, but SSRS is really good at drill-through reports, and most reports that I've come across work better as drill down reports. There's not a lot you can do with just a single flat data structure. And when you do start to have drill through reports, it may be the case that you want to group by customer, then item, then invoice one day, and the next day you may want to see what are your biggest items. So you want to go by item and then by customer and then by invoice. That's not set in stone, and to set that in stone really limits what your end users can do with the report that you've written. So this is going to be how to specify runtime groupings. And indeed, those groupings are going to be customer, item, and invoice. Those are the three groups we're going to have. So let's start off by defining a data table. Now, first off, we don't absolutely need to do it this way. If we added a parameter, and this would be the group 1 parameter, we could then just say, okay, group 1, its values take these non-queried values. And we could say this could be a customer. So the customer would be like a group by invoice account, and the label for that would be customer. And then, specify this down for, the item is the item ID and the invoice is the invoice ID. Problem is this gets difficult to maintain when you have multiple subgroups. We're going to have 3 grouping levels that we're going to allow. And so any change we have to make to that, we have to change it to all 3 of these groups. And additionally, these groups, it's not typically the case that the thing you want to group by is enough information about that entity. So for example, a customer, the specification of a customer is, its unique quality is the invoice account, but it also has this name which goes along with the invoice account, and the two together really form the cohesive identity of a customer. And in general, data entities will have unique IDs and names. And so we're going to build that into the structure where somehow we want this customer thing to have both an invoice account, which specifies that that's the ID label, but we also want it to have a name label, which is the invoicing name. And we want to be able to set that. And so we can do that inside of a custom table, which we're then going to use for the values. So let's just start by building up that table. This will begin to make more sense. I'm going to just create a separate method outside of everything that's just going to return this data table. Get grouping spec table. And we don't need any parameters on that because this is just something we're going to define. So we're going to define a data table, ret equals new data table, and we are going to add some columns here. We're going to use this overload. We're going to specify the column name and the type. So the name of this column is going to be the label, and it's going to be type of string. So that's going to be the thing that we're going to see on our drop down when we select what we're grouping by. I'm going to add 2 more columns. The columns are going to be ID call and name call. Now this is going to be the name of the column from the query, which represents this entity's ID and name. So when we populate this, you'll start to see what that's for. So if we go ret.rows.add, and we're going to use the second overload here, so we're just going to supply it values. So the first one is label, so start with customer. and the customer's ID column is invoice account. And the name of a customer is contained in the column invoicing name. So we're going to add two more of these. There's going to be item. The item's ID is item ID. The name is actually just name. If you look at our value here, it's just name here. That's the cust invoice trans level. And then under invoice, that has an ID, but there actually isn't a name for an invoice. Invoice doesn't have anything that's like a name, but one meaningful piece of information is going to be the invoice date. And that's always, that piece of information is at the, got a little typo there. That piece of information is always at the invoice level. So this is actually a really good spot for it. You'll see where that comes into play when we actually start putting these on the table. But for now, let's return ret. So another thing we're going to need to do is, since these parameters, when we define a parameter here, the data set, we can only get a value and a label. What we need to do is we need to be able to get that name column for a specified parameter value. And the parameter value is going to be this ID column. So I'm going to define a data method that'll do just that. In just a minute, we are going to get, we're actually going to populate a data table. So this is not going to be a method here. This is going to be a declaration, public static data table groupables equals get grouping spec table. So basically, we're going to run this method once, and we're going to store that table off into groupables, so that we can always use it. So now I'm going to define another method, public, and this method is going to return a string, which is going to represent the name column for a specified ID column. So public static string get name call from string ID call. So how we're going to do that is we're just going to search this groupables table. We're going to say return groupables, and we're going to use link to do this. You don't need to use link to do this, but I find it to be the easiest way to do. As enumerable dot where the data row is going to go to the Boolean data row ID call dot toString equals ID call. And so now we've filtered this down, but we actually just need to return one of the values from there. It's going to be unique, we know that already just by how we defined it, but it's still a set of data rows. But if we call first, then that will just be a single data row. And actually, let's do this in a more link way. We could just call, since this first is going to return a data row, then we could just call the name call value of that data row. But this looks a little goofy. It's not apparent that this is a data column. So let's actually use something like select, which select takes a data row and turns it into that data row's name call toString. And then let's do that. That should do the trick. So this select basically just transforms that into a string. The fact that we did it there just makes it easier to read rather than returning a data row and getting a string out of it as a data row. So that's going to get us our name column. And then the one thing we need to do still too is that in order to get this table, this groupables table that we defined here, into a data set, we need to, in order to get it into the parameters dropdown, we need to make it a data set here. So in order to make it a data set, we have to set a accessible data method for that. Now we could just make this getGroupingSpec table a data method, but then we'd have to call it for each time. It doesn't take very long to call, but we've already made it once. We don't need to make it 4 or 5 times. So let's just create a new data method here. A view code. And that data method is going to return a data table. And that method is going to be called available groups. And that is just going to return this data table that we've already made, just groupables. That's it. So we're going to rebuild our business logic, add a data set. The data set is going to be called available groups, and that's going to be from business logic available groups. Okay, so now we're going to get these groupings, and we're going to have their values come from available groups. The value field is going to be the ID column, and the label field is going to be the label, and that's group 1. And now we're going to take group 2, values, dataset, available groups, value is ID column, and label is name. Okay, and this group 3 is going to be from available groups, ID call, and label, just like everything else. So this just lets us specify what we want to be grouping by. And notice we don't need to feed these groups down to this demo custrans or any of the other data sets really, because they don't change what data we select. They're actually going to change how we're going to display it. And I'll show you how to do that here with a precision design. Alright, we just encountered a problem, so we're going to restart Visual Studio here. I may pause it if it takes a while. We will see. This is one of the major headaches with Visual Studio 2008 and AX. It's really, really buggy. I don't know if that's been your guys' experience as well, but in my experience, it's been pretty difficult. Alright, well, we missed a couple things. Alright, we've got available groups there, so we just need to add that data set. Sometimes you have to do things twice. Yep, that's not what we want. Okay, available groups, parameters, group 1, available groups, ID column label, group 2, available groups, ID call and label, and group 3, available groups, ID call, and label. Okay. Now we're going to delete that design. We are going to add a precision design. Okay, and it worked here. So it's going to execute the query a couple times. That's just, I think, to get structure. But anyways, we're going to add a table here. And we're going to go into this table properties, select it, and we're going to have the dataset name for this table be demo custom invoice trans. That's our main dataset. Once we've set that, we can go into table properties, and we're going to add 3 groups. And the grouping expression is going to be fields and the field name. Now, if you're not familiar with this, you can call fields either with this exclamation point, or you could call this same field via this syntax. Inside the parentheses, you compute some string, and this will get that same value. Now, how we're going to use this to our advantage is, since the value of group 1 was the name of the column that we want to group by for group 1, it was the ID column, then it's fields, parameters, group1.value.value. So that's our grouping expression for group 1. And we only want a header. You'll see why in a minute. So we're going to add an expression for group 2. And that group 2 expression is going to be this, except the parameter isn't group 1 parameter anymore, it's group 2. Okay, and we only want a footer. And we're going to add another one, group 3. That expression is going to be that. And that one we want to not only include a group footer too. So I'm going to get rid of this details. Now I'm going to run through this pretty quick here. But we are going to put our group type here. That's going to be the label of the group type. So this is going to be customer if this is a customer. Then we're going to have our group ID, which is going to be the customer ID or the item ID or the invoice ID. Then we're going to have the group name, and this is why we define that name thing there. Because next to the customer ID, we want the customer name. But if it was an item group, then we want the item name next to customer ID. So rather than have 3 columns for customer, item, and what have you, we're just going to have the group name there, and we're going to compute that with that other function we made. And this is going to be the dollar amount, and this is going to be the quantity. So group type for group 1, see we're on group 1 there, is very easy. The type is just going to be the label, not the value, of the group 1 parameter. So we can just call that, and that's good to go. This one, this group ID, is the same expression that we grouped by. So it's fields, and then it's the group 1 parameter value, and it's the field value of that particular field. I'm going to stretch this out a little more. You'll see why in a minute. And then here we want fields something.value, but that thing that we want is the name column, which we can get via our data method that we defined. Via our data method that we did not define correctly. Business logic. Get name call. See, this is not a data method here. We didn't actually define that as a data method. I'm going to do this since we already wrote it. You could have gone into the Moxel and right-clicked and said new data method and put this stuff in there. But this is good enough just to tell the compiler that that's a data method. So I'm going to rebuild the business logic. I'm going to go into this design. I'm going to save this design for now and close it because I believe that I need to close out of designer and get back into it in order for it to recalculate what my data methods are. So there it is, get name call. So get name call took an argument which was the ID column, and the ID column for group 1 was in parameter 1. So that will get us the field value of the name column. I'm going to stretch that out. You'll see why in a minute. And the next expressions are just very easy. This is the dollar amount is sum of the line amount, and the quantity is sum of the quantity. Okay, now the reason I stretched all those out is because I need to get these all for the other grouping levels. So I am just going to be lazy, and I'm going to paste those down here. while I'm merging stuff, I'm going to do a little formatting here too. Let's make that called grand total. It sounds more grand. Okay, and then here, this isn't group 1, that's group 2. This isn't group 1, that's group 3. And that's why I extended them out a little bit, so I can just go down the list and change them here. This, you can't necessarily do this in R2, but R2 is way better in a lot of other ways, so it's totally worth it. Okay, now we're just going to do a couple of little formatting things. We're going to bold that. We're going to make these back to a reasonable size here, because the group ID does not need to be that big. Bring these down. I'm going to make the format of the quantity an N2 format. Actually, I'm going to make it an N0 because our quantities are all whole numbers. If you have fractional quantities, you may want to make that an N2. This is going to be a C2. That's the format for currency, 2 decimal places. I'm going to bring this table up to the upper corner of my report. I'm going to make my report smaller to match. And then one more very important thing I'm going to do is I want to make these drill throughs. Okay, and I want this box to be how to drill into the next value. So I need to label these text boxes. Right now it's called text box 10. I'm going to call this group type 1, which means it's the group type text box and it's level 1. This text box then is going to be called group type 2. This text box, I lost the value there. This text box is going to be called group type 3. Okay, so now how I make these drill downs rather than just groupings is I go into groups. Group 1 is fine, that's always going to show up. Group 2, we want to say it's hidden but can be toggled by that group type 1 text box. And group 3 is hidden but can be toggled by the group type 2 text box. Okay, so that's going to make them drop downs, and we're just going to go in and do just a tiny little formatty thing here. I'm going to make these, let's say, medium turquoise, and then I'm going to make this one pale turquoise. It doesn't really matter. You can choose something that that works out. I like to do colors though on the groups so that you can tell that they're they're separated. So we're going to go ahead and save that design, close this down, and we are going to run our precision design. And you'll notice we'll hit any customer. Then we're going to want to group by, well, whatever we want to group by. We can group by customer, then invoice, then item, which will show us customer invoices. So here's our customers, and then they have these invoices, and these invoices have these items on them. Now you'll notice a couple things on the previewer. You know, you'll have to take my word for this because I'm not going to go deploy this report out. But the $sign, the default $sign in the previewer is this strange symbol, at least in mine. That's very strange. The other thing too is the parameters .label does not work in the previewer, but this will say the word customer once I deploy this, and this will say the word invoice once I deploy this, and this will say the word item once I deploy this. And that is the labels of these things here, so customer, item, and invoice. So that you'll just have to trust me on. I'll deploy the report at the end and we'll see the whole thing. But yeah, you can see here we have these customers here, we got the grand totals and all that stuff. Now the other thing we could do is if we wanted to do this by then item and then customer and then invoice, take a look and we'll see, okay, you know, these are my big items and this is who's ordering those items, you know, and then this is, you know, when they ordered those things. So you can see that that gives you a lot of flexibility. It may be overkill for this report, but flexible groupings can let you do a lot with a single report that you would have to have multiple reports to do otherwise.